Jonathan Reed stared at the holographic notification hovering above his kitchen table, the blue light casting eerie shadows across his modest apartment. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten the moment the message appeared. Congratulations, Mr. Reed. You are now the sole proprietor of the Celestial Trust Bank, with assets totaling approximately 4.7 trillion galactic credits. He blinked, waiting for the punchline. Practical jokes had evolved considerably since the advent of personalized holographic messaging, but this one seemed particularly elaborate. He waved his hand through the projection, expecting it to dissolve into some advertisement for discount space travel or a new virtual reality game. The message remained, pulsing gently. "This is absurd," Jonathan muttered, running a hand through his disheveled brown hair. At 32, he was a mid-level accountant at a firm that specialized in Earth-Mars trade taxation. He'd never even been off-planet, let alone ventured into the broader galactic community. More importantly, he hadn't spoken to his uncle Dominic in nearly 20 years, not since the man had abandoned Earth to seek his fortune among the stars. The family had written him off as eccentric at best, delusional at worst. Apparently, they'd been wrong. The hologram expanded, revealing a formal-looking woman with silver skin, clearly Mercurian, wearing what Jonathan recognized as the official uniform of the Interstellar Notary Guild. "Mr. Reed, I am Notary Celine 7, personally appointed by your late uncle to execute his will. I understand this may come as a shock, but I assure you this is not a prank. Dominic Reed passed into the void 3 standard days ago, and his final instructions were most specific." Jonathan slumped back in his chair. "My uncle is dead? And he left me everything?" "Correct on both accounts, with one significant stipulation." The Mercurian's expression remained professionally neutral. "The entirety of the inheritance must be used to support female alien refugees throughout the galaxy. Any deviation from this purpose will result in immediate forfeiture of all assets to the Galactic Humanitarian Fund." Jonathan laughed, a short, startled sound. "That's oddly specific." "Your uncle was an oddly specific man, Mr. Reed. He believed that female refugees faced unique challenges in interstellar displacement. His personal studies showed they were 47% less likely to find new employment, 63% more likely to face violence, and 82% more likely to lose cultural identity when separated from their home worlds. But I don't know anything about alien cultures. I've never even met a non-human. That is why you have been granted a 6-month learning period before full implementation must begin. During this time, you will receive orientation and training on Nexus Station, where the bank's headquarters are located." Jonathan stood up and paced around his small kitchen. "And if I refuse? Then the assets will be liquidated and distributed according to the secondary provisions, which would be unfortunate. Your uncle built systems that sustain millions. A dissolution would cause considerable suffering." The weight of responsibility settled on Jonathan's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He'd always played it safe, predictable investments, steady job, quiet life. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. "When would I need to leave?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "A transport has been arranged for tomorrow morning. You are permitted to bring personal effects, but the bank will provide all necessary resources for your new position." Jonathan glanced around his apartment, at the life he'd carefully constructed. Orderly. Controlled. Boring, if he was being honest with himself. "Why me?" he finally asked. The Mercurian's silver features softened slightly. "Your uncle left a personal message to address that very question. Would you like me to play it?" Jonathan nodded, and the hologram shifted. Suddenly, the weathered face of a man he barely recognized filled his kitchen. Older, with the characteristic subtle stretching of features that came from long-term space habitation, but unmistakably his mother's brother. "Jonathan. If you're seeing this, then my gamble with experimental propulsion technology didn't pay off." Uncle Dominic chuckled. I've watched your career from afar. Cautious. Methodical. Ethical to a fault. Exactly what my organization needs now. I built something magnificent, nephew, but it's grown too large for one man's vision. It needs balance. It needs someone who sees numbers as more than profits, who sees them as people. Don't make my mistakes. Don't lose yourself in the vastness. Keep your humanity among the stars. They need it more than you know. The message ended, leaving Jonathan alone with an impossible decision and the feeling that his carefully planned life had just been launched into orbit without a spacesuit. I'll need to give notice at work, he said finally. Already taken care of, replied Notary Celine 7. Your employer has been generously compensated for the inconvenience. Jonathan laughed weakly. Of course they have. Tomorrow at dawn, then, Mr. Reed. Welcome to your inheritance. The transport vessel, Stellar Ascendant, was nothing like Jonathan had imagined. Rather than the sterile, utilitarian craft he'd seen in documentaries about space travel, he found himself standing in what could only be described as a floating luxury penthouse. Crystal chandeliers hovered without support, casting rainbow prisms across walls that shifted between transparent and opaque to reveal the breathtaking expanse of stars beyond. Your uncle preferred to travel in style, explained Captain Varina, a tall human woman with augmented eyes that glowed faintly blue. Said if you're going to hurtle through the void at impossible speeds, might as well do it with a glass of good whiskey in hand. Jonathan nodded weakly, still fighting the nausea that came with his first experience of artificial gravity adjustments. Earth's pull was all he'd ever known, and his body protested the change with each step. How long until we reach Nexus Station? He asked, gripping the back of a chair that seemed to be made from some sort of living material. It warmed beneath his touch. About 36 hours, standard time, the captain replied. We'll be making a hyperspace jump in approximately 2 hours. I suggest you rest before then. The first jump can be disorienting. That proved to be a magnificent understatement. When the jump came, Jonathan felt as though his body had been turned inside out, his consciousness stretched across light years before snapping back into place like an elastic band. He spent the next 4 hours curled in his quarters, wondering what madness had possessed him to accept this inheritance. By the time they approached Nexus Station, however, Jonathan had found his space legs. He stood at the viewing portal, watching as the massive structure grew from a distant speck to a sprawling metropolis hanging impossibly in the void. Unlike the elegant symmetry of most space stations he'd seen in media, Nexus was a chaotic, beautiful collision of architectural styles, some sections clearly built by species with very different concepts of geometry and physics than humans. It's home to over 4 million sentient beings from 723 recognized species, Captain Varina said, appearing silently beside him. Your uncle's bank occupies the central spire, that crystalline structure at the hub. The central spire caught the light of a distant sun, fracturing it into 1,000 colors that danced across the station's surface. Jonathan felt his breath catch. Whatever else his uncle had been, he'd had vision. And I'm supposed to run all this, he murmured. The captain smiled. Not alone. That would be impossible, even for someone with experience. You have a team waiting. But you are the new face, and the new heart. The docking procedure took nearly an hour, a careful dance of airlocks and gravity adjustments. When Jonathan finally stepped onto Nexus Station, he was greeted by a small delegation headed by a floating spherical robot about the size of a basketball. Greetings, Jonathan Reed, the sphere boomed in a voice surprisingly deep for its size. I am Voxel, your uncle's personal assistant and now yours. Welcome to Nexus Station. A slender being with iridescent skin and large, compound eyes stepped forward. I am Director Nylith of Operations. We have much to discuss, Mr. Reed, but first, perhaps you would like to freshen up after your journey? Jonathan opened his mouth to agree when alarms began blaring throughout the docking bay. Red emergency lights pulsed, and station security personnel, a mix of humans and aliens, rushed past them toward another docking area. "What's happening?" Jonathan asked, instinctively ducking as though under attack. Voxel's outer shell changed from silver to a concerned amber. "Incoming refugee vessel, critically damaged. Life support failing." Director Nilitha's compound eyes expanded. The Lemurian evacuation. It wasn't scheduled to arrive for another week. Lemurian? Jonathan repeated, struggling to keep up. Their home world was destroyed in a stellar event 3 months ago, Nilith explained briskly, already moving toward the commotion. "Your uncle had arranged for the survivors to be transported here in waves. This group must have encountered trouble." Before Jonathan could process this information, he found himself following the delegation toward the crisis. They arrived at an observation deck overlooking a larger docking bay where a ship that looked more like a wounded animal than a spacecraft was being carefully guided in by tractor beams. Its hull was scorched and torn, exposing inner chambers where lights flickered weakly. "Hull breach in their life support section," someone reported. "Atmosphere venting. We have approximately 20 minutes before total failure." Jonathan watched, heart pounding, as emergency crews prepared for rapid evacuation of the damaged vessel. This wasn't some abstract concept anymore, these were actual lives, hanging in the balance, apparently under his responsibility. "What can I do?" he asked Voxel. "You have authorization to release emergency funds," the AI responded. "Medical teams, temporary housing, supplies, all require immediate approval." Jonathan blinked. "Then approve it. Whatever they need. Amount required exceeds standard emergency protocols by 340%. I don't care. Do it." Voxel's color warmed to a pleased pink. "Authorization accepted. Your uncle would be pleased with your decisiveness." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Jonathan stood back, trying to stay out of the way while watching in awe as the station's emergency teams worked with practiced precision. The refugees were evacuated, 47 survivors, all female, their translucent skin glowing with a faint internal light that pulsed with what Jonathan assumed was fear or distress. One small Lemurian child, no more than 5 or 6 by human standards, broke away from the group and ran directly to Jonathan, wrapping glowing arms around his legs. She looked up at him with faceted eyes that reflected his startled expression back at him a dozen times. "She senses your authority here," explained a melodic voice. A taller Lemurian approached, her light pulsing in gentle patterns. "I am Talia, cultural ambassador for our people. You must be the nephew we were told about." Jonathan carefully patted the child's head, unsure of the proper protocol but unwilling to show hesitation. "I'm Jonathan Reed. I just arrived myself. I'm sorry about your world." Talia's light dimmed slightly. "As are we all. But we are grateful for this sanctuary." She knelt to speak to the child in a language that sounded like wind chimes, gently guiding her back toward the others. Turning back to Jonathan, she said, "Your uncle promised us a new beginning. He said his successor would honor that promise." Jonathan felt the weight of those words, of the trust placed in him by people he'd never met from a world he'd never seen. "I will. But I have a lot to learn." Talia's light brightened. "As do we all, Mr. Reed. As do we all." Later, in the opulent office that had once belonged to his uncle, Jonathan sat across from Director Nilith and Voxel, trying to absorb the staggering amount of information being presented to him. "The bank's assets are diverse," Nilith explained, manipulating a holographic display that showed hundreds of investments spread across multiple systems. "But your uncle's mandate is clear, all must be directed toward supporting female refugees." "Why only females?" Jonathan asked, the question that had been bothering him since the notary's first announcement. Statistical vulnerability, Voxel replied. Across 94% of known sentient species, females face disproportionate hardship during displacement. And, Nyleth added with a slight hesitation, your uncle had personal reasons. His first wife was a refugee who died because the proper support systems weren't in place. He never quite recovered from that loss. Jonathan stared out at the endless stars beyond the office windows, thinking of the Lemurian child who had run to him, of Talia's dignified grief, of the weight of expectation now resting on his shoulders. All right, he said finally. Show me what I need to know. As Nyleth began the orientation, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder what other surprises his eccentric uncle had left for him among the stars. 3 weeks into his new life, Jonathan sat at the head of a long table made from polished asteroid metal, surrounded by representatives from 17 different species. He still felt like an imposter, but he'd learned to hide it better. The crisp suit custom-tailored to his frame helped, as did Voxel's constant stream of information fed directly to his neural implant, a modification he'd reluctantly agreed to after realizing the sheer volume of data he needed to process daily. The Starlight Foundation, Jonathan said, his voice steadied despite his nerves. That's what we're calling it. A separate entity from the bank, but funded by it. Dedicated exclusively to the support, resettlement, and empowerment of female refugees across known space. High Commissioner Zorel, a towering Vexillian with skin like polished obsidian, flared her neck crests in what Jonathan had learned was skepticism. Pretty words, Mr. Reed. Your uncle was also fond of pretty words. But many promises were made that never materialized. Jonathan resisted the urge to fidget under her gaze. Vexillians could detect micro-expressions better than any lie detector. I'm not my uncle, Commissioner. I'm building something new, transparent, accountable, and genuinely focused on long-term solutions, not just temporary aid. The quarterly financial reports will be available to all governing bodies, added Nyleth, who had proven to be Jonathan's most valuable ally. And Mr. Reed has already committed 50 billion credits to immediate housing solutions. A murmur rippled through the assembled representatives. Even in galactic terms, 50 billion was a significant sum. From the far end of the table, a voice like gravel being crushed spoke up. And what does the human get out of this generosity? The speaker was Ambassador Krull, representative of the Tordarian Commerce Guild, and, Jonathan had been warned, one of his uncle's most bitter business rivals. Besides fulfilling the terms of my inheritance? Jonathan replied evenly. The satisfaction of making a difference. Krull's laugh sounded like metal scraping against stone. No one is that altruistic. I'm not claiming to be a saint, Ambassador. But I believe business can be ethical and still profitable. The foundation isn't charity, it's investment in potential. Refugees bring skills, cultural knowledge, and determination. Given the right support, they become contributors to any economy they join. Before Krull could respond, the doors to the conference room slid open and Talia entered. Over the past weeks, she had become Jonathan's unofficial cultural advisor, helping him navigate the complex social dynamics of interspecies diplomacy. Today, her inner light pulsed with a calm confidence that immediately commanded the room's attention. Forgive my interruption, she said, her melodic voice carrying to every corner. But I bring news from the Lemurian settlement. The agricultural program Mr. Reed funded has yielded its first harvest. Our crystal fruits, once thought lost with our homeworld, are growing again. She placed a translucent fruit that seemed to contain galaxies within its flesh on the table. A token of our gratitude, and proof that with proper support, what seems destroyed can be reborn. The symbolic gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. Jonathan watched as even Krull's stony expression softened slightly. The Foundation will focus on 5 key areas, Jonathan continued, seizing the moment. Housing, healthcare, education, cultural preservation, and economic opportunity. Each refugee group will have direct input into how resources are allocated for their community. No top-down solutions imposed by those who don't understand their needs. By the end of the meeting, 13 of the 17 representatives had pledged their support. It wasn't unanimity, but it was a strong start. As they filed out, Talia remained behind, her light pulsing in what Jonathan had come to recognize as amusement. "You're becoming quite the diplomat," she observed. A far cry from the terrified human who couldn't figure out how to use the atmospheric adjusters in his quarters. Jonathan groaned at the memory. He'd accidentally set his living space to Jovian pressure his first night and had to be rescued by emergency services. "Don't remind me. I still have nightmares about exploding." Yet here you stand, convincing some of the most skeptical beings in the quadrant to trust you with their most vulnerable citizens. Not all of them. Krull would rather see me fail spectacularly. Talia's light dimmed slightly. "The Tordarian Commerce Guild has complicated history with your uncle. Ambassador Krull believes your foundation threatens their monopoly on refugee resettlement contracts." "Monopoly?" Jonathan frowned. "I thought refugee assistance was humanitarian work. In an ideal universe, perhaps. But there is profit to be made in suffering, Mr. Reed. Labor contracts, mineral rights concessions, cultural artifacts acquisition, the Guild has built wealth from the displacement of others for centuries." This was the part of galactic economics that still shocked Jonathan despite his financial background. The scale of exploitation was difficult to comprehend. All the more reason to establish the foundation, then. "Yes, but be cautious. The Guild does not yield territory easily, and you have just declared yourself a competitor." Later that evening, in the privacy of his quarters, Jonathan reviewed the day's events with Voxel. Probability of Foundation success now calculated at 64%, the AI reported, its shell glowing a cautiously optimistic yellow. An improvement of 23% since initial proposal. Still leaves a 36% chance of spectacular failure, Jonathan sighed, pouring himself a drink from a bottle of what his uncle's notes had labeled as the finest spirit in 3 quadrants. It tasted like liquid starlight and honey. Considering the opposition, 64% is remarkably high, Voxel countered. Your uncle's highest probability calculation for any humanitarian project was 48%. Jonathan swirled the luminescent liquid in his glass. "Tell me something, Voxel. Was my uncle actually a good man? Everyone seems to have such different opinions of him." The AI's color shifted to a contemplative blue. Dominic Reed was complex. His methods were often questionable, but his goals were ultimately benevolent. He believed the end justified the means. And what about his business with the Tordarian Commerce Guild? Talia hinted there was bad blood there. Accessing restricted records, Voxel hummed. After a moment, the AI continued, your uncle outmaneuvered the Guild on 17 major contracts over the last decade. The final incident involved the Zenovian displacement, where he underbid them by nearly 40%. Jonathan frowned. Underbid on a refugee crisis? That makes it sound like a business opportunity? Yes. Your uncle provided superior services at lower cost, but he still profited substantially. The revelation left a sour taste in Jonathan's mouth, worse than any space sickness. Had his uncle's humanitarian concerns been genuine, or just another angle for profit? And what did that make Jonathan, unknowingly stepping into the same role? A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, a visitor at his door. The security screen showed Talia waiting outside, her light pulsing with what seemed like urgency. Let her in, Jonathan told Voxel, quickly setting aside his drink. Talia entered, her usual composure replaced by evident agitation. We have a problem. The housing complex for the Lemurian refugees has been denied construction permits. The station authorities claim structural concerns, but my sources say Ambassador Krull met with the Zoning Commission this afternoon. That didn't take long, Jonathan muttered. Can we appeal? We can, but it will take weeks. My people are currently housed in emergency quarters that will be needed for an incoming Deltarian group in 5 days. Jonathan paced the room, mind racing through options. What if we bypass the station altogether? Your people need light, water, and specific atmospheric conditions, right? Could we create that environment on a vessel instead? Talia's light brightened with interest. A ship? As temporary housing? Not just any ship. Jonathan turned to Voxel. My uncle's personal yacht, the Stellar Reflection. How quickly could it be refitted as a Lemurian habitat? The Stellar Reflection could accommodate approximately 200 individuals with minor modifications. Estimated conversion time, 72 hours. Jonathan nodded decisively. Do it. And make sure it's registered under the Foundation, not my personal holdings. Let's see Krull try to block that. Talia's light pulsed with what Jonathan had come to recognize as her version of a smile. Creative problem solving, Mr. Reed. You might survive galactic politics after all. As she left to share the news with her people, Jonathan returned to the viewport, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. Somewhere out there were more refugees, more crises, more obstacles, and apparently, more enemies than he'd bargained for. The Starlight Foundation had taken its first tentative steps, but the path ahead was far from clear. Incoming transmission from Earth, Voxel announced. Your former employer. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Put them through. As his old boss's face appeared on the communication screen, full of awkward congratulations and thinly veiled attempts to secure investment for the firm, Jonathan reflected on how distant his previous life already seemed. The drab office, the predictable routine, the limited horizons, all replaced by challenges that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. For better or worse, Jonathan Reed, ordinary accountant, was gone. In his place stood the founder of the Starlight Foundation, and apparently, the newest player in a galactic game whose rules he was still learning. The calm automated voice belied the chaos unfolding within the Stellar Reflection. Alarms blared as Jonathan raced through corridors filling with pale blue mist, atmospheric leakage from the Lemurian living quarters. Ahead of him, emergency teams were already deploying, their movements precise despite the urgency. What happened? Jonathan demanded, reaching the main engineering bay where Nylith was coordinating the response. Coolant system failure in the ship's primary reactor, she replied, compound eyes rapidly scanning multiple holographic displays. Temperature spiked, causing a cascade of secondary failures including a breach in the atmospheric containment for Section 7. The Lemurian nursery, Jonathan realized with horror. Casualties? None reported so far. The emergency shields activated in time. It was the fourth accident in 3 months. First, the contaminated food supply for the Deltarian refugees. Then the navigation malfunction that nearly sent a transport of Etherian survivors into a mining zone. 2 weeks ago, financial records had been mysteriously altered, making it appear that funds were being embezzled from relocation grants. And now this, the most dangerous incident yet. This wasn't an accident, Jonathan said quietly, watching as technicians rushed to stabilize the ship's systems. Nylith's antennae twitched in agreement. I've already secured the engineering logs. The coolant system was manually overridden at 0347 hours. Someone with high-level clearance. How many people have that kind of access? 23, including yourself. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, a habit from his Earth days that he hadn't managed to break. I want interviews with all of them. Security scans, timeline verification, the works. Already underway, Nylith assured him. But Jonathan. If this is sabotage as we suspect, we're dealing with someone sophisticated. There may not be traces to find. He knew she was right. Whoever was targeting the Foundation had resources, access, and apparently no moral qualms about endangering innocent lives. The Tordarian Commerce Guild was the obvious suspect, but something about the attacks felt more personal than corporate competition. "Where's Talia?" he asked suddenly, realizing he hadn't seen her among the emergency responders. "Unknown. She was scheduled to meet with cultural preservation specialists this morning." A cold feeling settled in Jonathan's stomach. "Find her. Now." It took nearly an hour, but they located Talia in a seldom-used archival room deep within the station, surrounded by ancient data crystals and physical manuscripts. Her inner light was pulsing rapidly in what Jonathan had learned to recognize as deep concentration. "Talia," he called from the doorway. "There was an incident on the stellar reflection. Everyone's safe, but we need to." It was deliberate, she interrupted, not looking up from the fragment of text she was studying. "Just like the others. I know why." Jonathan moved closer, noticing the exhaustion evident in her dimmed luminescence. "Have you been here all night?" "I needed answers," she said simply. "After the financial records were altered, I started looking into your uncle's past dealings. There's a pattern, Jonathan." She gestured to the materials spread around her, star charts, contract documents, incident reports spanning decades. "The refugee crises your uncle specialized in, many weren't natural disasters or conflicts. They were engineered." Jonathan stared at her, the implications too terrible to fully comprehend. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your uncle didn't just profit from displacement. In some cases, he, or those working for him, created the conditions that led to it." She pulled up a holographic display showing a familiar system. "Remember the Lemurian stellar event? The one that destroyed our homeworld? Natural phenomena don't typically leave behind traces of experimental propulsion technology." The words from his uncle's final message echoed in Jonathan's mind. "If you're seeing this, then my gamble with experimental propulsion technology didn't pay off." "No," he whispered. "He wouldn't have. The evidence suggests otherwise." Talia's voice was gentle but firm. "The Zenovian displacement, the Etherian civil war, the Deltarian plague, all connected to subsidiaries of Celestial Trust. All resulting in profitable refugee management contracts. All disproportionately affecting female populations." Jonathan felt physically ill. The scope of what she was suggesting was monstrous, genocide for profit, with a veneer of humanitarian response to mask the crimes. And he had inherited it all, unwittingly becoming the face of an organization built on engineered suffering. "If this is true," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady, "then the attacks on the Foundation aren't just about competition. They could be revenge. Justice, even." Talia's light pulsed in acknowledgement. "It would explain the personal nature of the sabotage. Someone knows the truth and believes you're continuing your uncle's work. We need to go to the authorities." "With what proof? Ancient data crystals and circumstantial connections? The Interstellar Tribunal requires irrefutable evidence for cases of this magnitude. And more importantly, what happens to all those currently depending on the Foundation if it collapses under scandal?" She was right. Tens of thousands of refugees across dozens of species now relied on Starlight Foundation support. If funding suddenly disappeared, the humanitarian crisis would be immediate and devastating. "So what do we do?" Jonathan asked, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like the gravity of a gas giant. Before Talia could answer, Voxel burst into the room, its shell pulsing an urgent red. "Security breach detected. Unauthorized access to primary vault." "The quantum vault?" Jonathan asked, alarmed. The Foundation's most sensitive data and valuable assets were stored there. "Affirmative. Intruder identified as former Security Chief Darius Vale." Jonathan's blood ran cold. Vale had been one of his uncle's most trusted associates, and one of the few people Jonathan had dismissed upon taking control. What's he after? Unclear. Vault access logs show focus on section XIVC. What's in that section? Jonathan demanded. Voxel's color shifted to a troubled purple. Classified personal records of Dominic Reed. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Talia. Could those records confirm what you found? Or worse, she replied grimly. Lock down the station, Jonathan ordered. No ships depart until we find Vale. But they were too late. By the time station security reached the vault, Vale was gone, along with a single data crystal containing what Voxel identified as contingency protocols. The next day, as Jonathan was reviewing enhanced security measures with Nilith, an unmarked message arrived on his private channel. The truth cannot remain buried forever, Reed, it read. Your uncle destroyed worlds for profit. How many generations of my people wander homeless because of him? Now you perpetuate his legacy, pretending benevolence while reaping the benefits of our suffering. I have what I need to expose you both. The Galactic Assembly will learn what the Celestial Trust really is, a parasite feeding on engineered tragedy. The message was signed simply, Justice. Can we trace it? Jonathan asked, passing the message to Nilith. She examined it, antennae twitching in frustration. Impossible. It was relayed through 17 different systems with quantum encryption at each jump. Jonathan paced his office, mind racing. Vale must be working with someone. The sabotage didn't stop when he left the station. The Tordarian Commerce Guild would have resources to assist him, Nilith suggested. Or anyone else who suffered from my uncle's schemes, Jonathan countered. Which, if Talia's research is correct, could be half the known galaxy. That evening, Jonathan called an emergency meeting of his most trusted advisors, Nilith, Talia, and surprisingly, High Commissioner Zorel, whose initial skepticism had evolved into cautious support over the months. I need absolute honesty, Jonathan began after explaining what they'd discovered. Did any of you know about my uncle's involvement in creating these crises? Zorel's neck crests flattened in what Jonathan recognized as solemnity. Rumors existed. Dominic Reed's ethical flexibility was well known. But allegations of this magnitude require evidence few could obtain. And now Vale has that evidence, Nilith added. The question is what he intends to do with it. Expose everything, if his message is sincere, Jonathan said. Which means we need to move first. You'd expose your own uncle's crimes? Zorel asked, studying him intently. I'd expose the truth, Jonathan replied firmly. Whatever it is. These refugees deserve to know why they lost their homes, their families. And if the foundation was built on blood money, that needs to be addressed openly. Talia's light brightened with approval. But exposing everything could destroy what you've built. The backlash would be immediate. Then we need to transform, not just expose, Jonathan said, an idea forming as he spoke. If my uncle's wealth came from creating crises, then it's only right that it goes toward healing the damage he caused. But it has to be more than charity, it has to be reparation. He turned to Voxel, who had been hovering silently nearby. Show me every investment, every asset linked to Celestial Trust. I want to know exactly what we're working with. As the AI projected a complex network of holdings spanning hundreds of worlds, Jonathan began to see not just the enormity of his uncle's crimes, but also the potential for redemption. We're going to beat Vale to the punch, he announced. We'll expose everything ourselves, but simultaneously announce the complete restructuring of the Foundation. Total transparency, oversight committees led by representatives from affected species, and transition of ownership, 51% of all assets transferred to a collective trust managed by refugee communities. Zorel flared her crests in surprise. You'd give up control? I never wanted control, Jonathan admitted. I wanted to do good. And I can't do that while profiting from my uncle's crimes, even unknowingly. As the meeting continued late into the night, plans taking shape for what would be the most dramatic transformation of wealth and power in recent galactic history, Jonathan caught Talia watching him, her light pulsing in a pattern he'd never seen before. What? He asked during a brief break. I'm trying to determine, she said softly, if you're extraordinarily noble or extraordinarily naive. Jonathan laughed, the sound tinged with exhaustion. Probably both. Does it matter? Perhaps not, she replied, her light warming to a gentle glow. As long as you're also extraordinarily careful. Veil isn't the only threat. When word spreads of what you intend to do, many powerful entities will move to stop you, including some you currently count as allies. As if to emphasize her warning, Jonathan's secure comm unit chimed with an incoming message from Ambassador Krull, requesting an urgent private meeting. Let the games begin, Jonathan muttered, squaring his shoulders. The path ahead was dangerous, but for the first time since learning of his inheritance, he felt certain of his direction. The foundation his uncle had built through destruction, Jonathan would rebuild through truth, no matter the personal cost. The Grand Assembly Hall of Nexus Station had never been so full. Representatives from hundreds of worlds sat in tiered seating arranged in a perfect circle, their varied physiologies accommodated by specialized environmental pods. At the center stood a single platform where Jonathan Reed, dressed in a simple white suit without adornment or insignia, waited for the proceedings to begin. In the 6 weeks since discovering the truth about his uncle's operations, Jonathan had barely slept. Every waking moment had been devoted to preparing for this day, gathering evidence, securing allies, and most critically, designing a new framework for what would become the Galactic Reparation Collective. High Commissioner Zorel, serving as moderator, activated the amplification field. Her voice resonated through the chamber, automatically translated into 723 different languages. This emergency session of the Interstellar Congress is now convened. Jonathan Reed, acting chairperson of the Celestial Trust Banking Consortium and founder of the Starlight Foundation, has requested this forum to make an announcement of galactic significance. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Many had come expecting a standard policy initiative or perhaps a new refugee assistance program. The gravitas of the proceeding suggested something far more consequential. Before I begin, Jonathan said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart, I wish to acknowledge the presence of Darius Vale. A surprised stir swept through the crowd as security spotlights swiveled to illuminate a figure standing near one of the exits, a tall, gaunt human with cybernetic enhancements visible along his jawline. Vale's expression betrayed nothing, but his posture was tense, ready to flee. Mr. Vale is not to be detained, Jonathan continued. He is here at my invitation, granted full diplomatic immunity for the duration of these proceedings. His actions, while technically criminal, have served the greater good by bringing essential truths to light. Vale's surprise was evident, his hand dropping from where it had been hovering near what was almost certainly a concealed weapon. For those who don't know him, Darius Vale was my uncle's head of special operations. He has recently acquired evidence that confirms what many have long suspected but could never prove. Jonathan activated the central holographic display. It showed a series of star systems, each with catastrophic events highlighted, supernovae, planetary extinctions, civil wars, industrial disasters. What you are seeing is a record of deliberate destruction orchestrated by Dominic Reed, my uncle, through various shell companies and proxies over the past 3 decades. The assembly erupted in shock. Security drones deployed automatically, hovering at strategic points throughout the chamber as tensions escalated. Silence. Zorel commanded, her neck crests fully extended in authority. The speaker will be heard. As the chaos subsided, Jonathan continued, the evidence is conclusive and has been verified by independent forensic analysts from 7 different systems. My uncle didn't just profit from refugee crises, he manufactured them, specifically targeting female-dominated societies that he believed would be more vulnerable, more easily controlled in the aftermath. He gestured to Talia, who stood in the Lemurian delegation pod, her light pulsed with solemn dignity. Including the destruction of Lumra, which we had believed was a natural stellar phenomenon. This is outrageous. Ambassador Krull's voice boomed from the Tordarian section. Where is your proof of these wild accusations? The proof has already been transmitted to every member of this Congress, Jonathan replied calmly. Including extensive documentation of your own guild's complicity, Ambassador. The Tordarian Commerce Guild competed with my uncle not because you opposed his methods, but because you wanted the profits for yourselves. Security drones moved closer to Krull as the ambassador lunged to his feet, stone-like skin cracking with rage. 2 Tordarian guards caught him by the arms, whispering urgently in his ear. After a tense moment, he sank back into his seat, glaring murderously at Jonathan. I did not come here merely to expose crimes, however heinous, Jonathan continued. I came to offer restitution. He pressed a sequence on the control panel before him, and the holographic display shifted to show the complex structure of the Celestial Trust's holdings. Effective immediately, I am dissolving the banking consortium as it has existed and transferring all assets, valued at approximately 4.7 trillion galactic credits, into a new entity, the Galactic Reparation Collective. This organization will be owned and governed by representatives from every affected species, with a mandate to use these resources to rebuild what was destroyed. The assembly hall fell completely silent, a rarity in a body known for its boisterous debates. This is not charity, Jonathan emphasized. It is justice. The wealth built on suffering will now serve those who suffered. The collective will operate independently, with a governing council elected by refugee communities themselves. From her position beside the Lemurian delegation, Nylith activated her communication link. And your role in this new collective, Mr. Reed? I will serve as transition coordinator for 1 standard year, after which